Welcome to God and Country Biblical Exposition. I'm your Bible teacher, Pastor B.E.Winship. In view of Mother's Day, we need to talk about the world's attack on motherhood and children. You know that if God established motherhood and the bearing of children and gender roles, the world and Satan is going to attack these things. Psalm chapter 2, the nations and the people will say, let us cast away God's boundaries from us. So this program is just to encourage mothers that they're on the right path, they've chosen the good way, and that their critics and their detractors are the evil people in this world. Last year, Emma Tettel with the Toronto Star put forth an editorial entitled, "It's Time to Do Away with Mother's Day. We need to scrap both Mother's Day and Father's Day for good, replacing them with Guardian Day, because those holidays assume that a parent is a female or a male." And there are other articles out there suggesting that we do away with Mother's Day because it creates pressure and guilt and expectations upon women. Many may not be mothers, and many may have had an abortion. And this is what the ungodly do. They destroy God's good purposes. Then they ban anyone who celebrates God's good purposes because they want to avoid guilt and conviction. But this is nothing new. With the rise of secularism in the 20th century, for the last 100 years, there has been a war against motherhood, God's established role for women. In the Communist Manifesto, written back in 1848, Chapter 2 is all about the abolition of the family. Quote, "The bourgeois family will vanish as a matter of course when its complement vanishes, private property, and both will vanish with the vanquishing of capital." It further reads, "Do you charge us with wanting to stop the exploitation of children by their parents? To this crime we plead guilty. But you say we destroy the most hallowed of relations when we replace the home education by social. The bourgeois clay trap about the family and education, about the hallowed correlation of parents and child, becomes all the more disgusting." Then the manifesto goes on to claim that in the traditional family, the wife is merely an instrument of production, and all that the family is legal prostitution. And the ideology of the manifesto was that the communists would liberate people from oppression. The oppression of private ownership, the oppression of labor, and all of the duties and the responsibilities of a mother and a father. And this is how the ungodly view God's laws and God's institutions. They are oppressions that need to be overthrown. Even God's authority is considered oppression. And in this, we see the theme, the core ideology of Satan, to take down God's laws and God's institutions by claiming that you're oppressed, that you're being exploited. And you're being oppressed and exploited by what society has held to be traditional values. So don't be naive. The young man or the young woman listening to this, either coming from their professors or coming from the media, might listen and say, hey, you know what? Maybe I am being oppressed. Maybe these traditional Christian morals and these biblical injunctions are oppressing me, exploiting me. I'm oppressed having to serve my husband. I'm oppressed having to love my wife and to lay my life down for her. I'm oppressed having to suffer hardships in raising children. How unfair is all this? I need to be free. It should be my choice, my body, my will. And doesn't this all sound very familiar? It was the same tactic used by Satan in the temptation of Adam and Eve in the garden, Genesis chapter 3. Genesis 3:4, the serpent said to the woman, "You surely will not die, For God knows that in the day you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good from evil. So Satan was saying, God is oppressing and exploiting you with all of these rules, with all of these boundaries. He's keeping you down. And the Communist Manifesto and feminist ideology today is nothing more than a sophisticated, longer version of Satan's arguments in Genesis chapter 3. Nothing has changed in the core arguments against God. That you're being oppressed and exploited, and you need to throw off God's boundaries concerning marriage and family and gender and child rearing. And this is the new definition of freedom and liberty. Freedom from God. Freedom from law. It's not liberty under law. It's liberty from law. And this is the feminist, often quoted slogan, a woman needs a husband like a fish needs a bicycle. In other words, women should be independent of men. But what says the scripture? 1 Corinthians 11:11, however, in the Lord, neither is the woman independent of the man, nor is the man independent of the woman. Both are needed. Both roles are needed. So Christians need to be wise and knowledgeable in these things. 2 Corinthians 2:11, so that no advantage would be taken of us by Satan, for we're not ignorant of his devices. So understand his ploy. Whenever you have to argue against this whole issue of feminism or gender nonconformity, remember it is all goes back to that basic argument and false ideology given by Satan in Genesis chapter 3. That God's ways are being depicted as oppressive. And that's the root of the lie. And as Jesus said, the axe needs to be laid at the root. And if you expose and you reveal the root, rather than just argue about the peripherals, you're going to leave your opponent convicted by the truth. So let's look at some Bible here. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15. This verse is considered one of those problematic texts with multiple interpretations. But as I've said before, the texts that we find are very difficult often yield the most fruit. The reason we're confused by such texts is because we're so spiritually dull. 1 Timothy 2:15, King James Version. Notwithstanding, she shall be saved in childbearing if they continue in faith, in charity, and holiness, and sobriety. The New International Version translates it the same way, but the woman will be saved through childbearing. And the difficulty in this text is understanding what is meant by the woman will be saved. The New American Standard Bible translates the word saved, preserved. The woman will be preserved through the bearing of children, as if this is some sort of special healing and protection for the Christian woman when she bears children. But the Greek word here is sozo, the typical word used in the New Testament for salvation, deliverance, redemption, conversion. So is this verse saying that heaven will be granted to women who bear children? No, Paul is referring back to the promise given to Eve back in Genesis chapter 3, that her offspring, the Messiah, will someday crush the head of the serpent, Satan, and hence deliver the human race from the dominion of Satan. Genesis 3:15, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. The Messiah will crush the head of the house of evil. Habakkuk chapter 3, verse 13. And this is the context in which Paul is giving this promise in 1 Timothy 2:15. In verses 12 through 13, Paul is writing about the creation of Adam and Eve, and Eve being deceived by the serpent. And the point is that even though Eve was deceived by the serpent, and fell into sin, her consolation is that through childbearing, she would give birth to her Savior. Her great, 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 many greats grandson would be the Messiah. And so in that sense, she is saved through this gift of procreation. And so the example Paul is given is not of all women, but of one individual woman and her child. But nevertheless, Paul is applying this principle to all women. For all women are given this gift of bearing children, and childbearing is their great blessing from God. The word saved here does carry the idea of being rescued or helped, and all women are rescued and helped by bearing children. Childbearing and motherhood is a gift from God. It gives them purpose and meaning in bringing people into this world. And of course, Satan wants to steal and destroy whatever good gifts God gives to his people. First, by trying to directly destroy the offspring of the woman who would crush his head. Think of how Satan stirred up Herod to kill all of the babies in Bethlehem, hoping to get at the Messiah. But secondly, Satan wants to kill off all of the offspring of the woman, to destroy motherhood and to destroy the children. As C.S. Lewis once wrote about Satan, that Satan hates these little vermin made in the image of God. Every time he looks at a human, he is reminded of God, his enemy. And if he can't destroy God, Satan will destroy those made in the image of God. In Revelation chapter 12, we get another picture of Satan's attack on women and the family. The text is an allegory describing Satan's battle against God throughout the ages. Chapter 12, verse 4, Satan takes a third of the angels with him in his rebellion against God. Chapter 12, verse 5, Satan seeks to destroy the woman who gives birth to a male child who is to rule the nations. That's Jesus Christ. Then Satan is thrown out of heaven, verse 9. And what does he do? Down in verse 13, he persecutes the woman, Israel, the Israel of God. And then verse 17, he goes off to make war with the rest of her offspring. The rest of her offspring is speaking of the rest of the children born to the women, specifically the Christians. And again, Satan hates these little vermin. The children made in the image of God, they might actually receive the second birth and live to glorify God for all eternity, and Satan doesn't want that. So Satan is intent on destroying the family and motherhood and Christian education and Christian evangelism. He destroys God's plan for the family by divorce, by prostitution, by pornography, by birth control, by overpopulation alarmism. He throws the entire kitchen sink against God and God's plan. And wouldn't you know it, the ideological left in America turns out to be the culture of death. Pro-abortion, anti-motherhood. They are the party of infanticide. No longer are they saying abortion must be safe, legal, and rare. They have moved on to their real intent. Abortion for any reason. In Russia, that grand experiment in Marxist ideology, the population is declining by 600,000 per year because secular ideology doesn't believe in the family. Children are an inconvenience, not a blessing from the Lord, not a gift to women. In Europe, in its leftism, it's in the same condition, a declining population. If you're to look back at the chart of childbearing in the United States over the last 200 years, you will see that as our culture has become less Christian, couples have had less children. This is called the fertility rate. In 2015, the fertility rate in America was 1.84 children per woman. In 1961, it was 3.62 children per woman. And in 1860, it was 7.58 children per woman. Because large families were honored, and children were considered a blessing from the Lord, not a curse. From a study called Religion and Fertility Rates in America, women who said religion is very important had 3 times as many children as women who said religion is not very important. And here's another interesting statistic. The decline in religion in America can be seen in the decline in children being given biblical names. And the 3 charts are identical. The decline in religion, the decline in the use of biblical names in America, and the decline in the fertility rate. Now, the excuse used by secularists is that the reason for large families in the past was economics. Children were for the purpose of more workers on the farm, and since we're no longer an agricultural society, we need less children. As in the Communist Manifesto, children and wives were simply for economic exploitation. But that is the spin the ungodly put on the Christian culture, a way to explain away a culture that believes what God has to say about the blessing of motherhood and children. Psalm 127. Behold, children are a gift of the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a reward. Like arrows in the hands of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. How blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. They will not be ashamed when they speak with their enemies in the gate. So when a people group believe the word of God, it makes a huge difference in family values. Children and motherhood are not considered a hardship or a great sacrifice because they're so valued. As opposed to Iowa Democratic State Representative Beth Weasel, who advocated aborting children to avoid sleepless nights and to avoid disciplinary challenges, or Amy Glass. At the website Thought Catalog, she wrote a piece entitled, I Look Down on Young Women with Husbands and Kids, and I'm Not Sorry. So, true Christianity promotes motherhood and children. Secularism evidently disparages motherhood and children. And this is happening on a spiritual, unconscious level. Satan's so successful in all this, in his feminist ideology, that he's even convinced women to abandon motherhood and to take on for themselves the role of men. I picked up a book recently on the clearance rack, Feste and Feminine by Penny Young Nance. She is the president of the Christian activist group called Concerned Women for America. And I thought the book was rather good. In her intro, she does a really good job of accurately explaining what happened to mankind in the fall. She writes, the fall fractured not only humankind's relationship with God, but also the relationship between men and women. Relationships between men and women have become combative and unhealthy based on power dynamics, sexual objectification, and distrust on both sides. Certainly we can criticize both genders, but the polarization we face today, in which a man subjugates a woman or in which a woman responds with loathing to the perceived slight, has gone too far. Well said. But here's the point I want to get to. This problem of women taking on the role of men out of jealousy or out of the grass is greener on the other side of the fence syndrome. She writes, somewhere along the way, we took a dark turn. In an effort to relate, counter, or perhaps compete with men, we started copying their character flaws. She writes, we aren't just men with different plumbing. We are an entirely different, magnificent creation. The truth of our distinctiveness frees us from feminists' claim that we have to be tough, protective, aggressive, basically masculine. By appropriating the worst male behaviors and attitudes in our desire to protect ourselves, get to the top of the corporate world, or gain sexual empowerment, we detract from the unique identity God gave us as women. So the bottom line is that women are being told today that they should act like men, take the role of men, take the same jobs as men. And it's interesting that feminism wants women to be more like men, but at the same time, feminism wants men to be more like women. And this is what is called the feminization of men movement, especially in education. And this is a core tenet of liberalism. Satan and the world, they want to erase God's boundaries. Whatever boundaries God has established, they must be brought down. Now, FYI, for your information, feminism has been described as coming in 3 waves. You'll hear this description often. This is not a description that has been made up by conservatives, but something that feminists themselves have described as their changing goals and policies. The first wave, 1910 to 1950, women's suffrage, giving women the right to vote. The second wave, 1960 to 1980, the promotion of abortion. The exodus from the family and motherhood into the workplace. And then the third wave, 1990 to the present, the gradual erasing of all distinctions between men and women, the erasing of any distinction between the husband and wife in their family roles, the erasing of the distinction in the thinking or the desires between men and women, culminating in the elimination of male and female pronouns, homosexual marriage, transgenderism, gender nonconformity. And one of the great recent examples of this was Google firing one of their engineers, James Damore, for suggesting that there are more men in engineering because of scientifically proven biological differences between men and women. Men have more interest in building things, electronics. Women have more interest in relationships. And Damore's contradiction of the liberal narrative was so offensive that he had to be fired for even suggesting that there were differences between men and women. And the statements made against Damore in the media and by the Google management shows exactly the ideology of the left. This belief that gender is a human construct that needs to be dismantled. And another recent example is the Boy Scouts dropping boy from the title and allowing the girls to join. Again, because the secular left wants no gender distinctions, men and women are to have the same dress and the same locker rooms and the same interests and the same activities and be in the same clubs. And this assault by the left is against all of God's categorical structures, God's distinctions. So that on the left, homosexuality is to be as valid as heterosexuality, a one-parent family, or a same-sex partnership is to be just as valid as a man and a woman. And please understand that homosexuality, transgenderism, gender nonconformity is built upon the ideology of feminism. They are all tied together at the hip. They're all intersectional because it's all about throwing off of God's distinctions and claiming that these distinctions are oppressive. And you'll often hear conservatives say that the first wave of feminism was okay and the second wave was okay, but this third wave becomes problematic. But really, the first and the second wave were just as much an attack against God's roles for men and women as anything else. But the point I want us to see here is that feminism is the real war against women. The phrase war against women was used by the left to criticize the conservative right because the political right was against abortion. But it's actually feminism itself, this leftist ideology that is destroying women, that's even killing children. And they are robbing women of their God-given blessings by telling women that they need to abandon motherhood and child rearing and go and work on factory floors like the men, telling women that what men do in business is more important than bearing and caring for children. When the truth is that motherhood is a high calling for women. I mean, why would women want to sell their birthright like Esau? Why would they want to end life just with a bunch of pay stubs? Know the term complementarianism in regard to this whole conflict between Christianity and feminism. Feminists believe that women are equal with men, which means for them identical roles. Christianity believes in complementarianism, where women are equal with men, but they have different roles. And that difference is huge. Christianity believes the role of motherhood in the home is as equally a dignified career calling as a man called to do a construction business. But feminism is out there teaching women that they're only equal when they do everything that a man does. And the left is saying that women need to be independent of men and they need to support the family like men in the same way. But since God has not made us that way, feminism is abusing and misusing women, stealing from women God's best for them. There's a recent editorial in the Wall Street Journal where a feminist was complaining that motherhood is unemployment and that motherhood is limiting women in the workforce. Being a man, I am not really well aware of how women think, but all the young women I know tell me that the attitude in our society is that if you stay home with your children, you're looked down upon. Stay-at-home moms have been made to feel guilty. And so no wonder our daycares are filled with children. One of my own family members who stays at home to raise her children gets comments in the park like, well, you must be the nanny. Because obviously successful women are not supposed to be staying at home with children. And this is coming both from erroneous ideology and working women who are extremely jealous because they're working 40 hours a week, 3 hours a day in commuting, and they only get to see their children a couple hours a day. But they are being dutiful, liberal feminists, doing exactly what the Communist Manifesto planned for women, to put mothers into the factories. I came across this thought the other day. I can't remember the source. But the observation was that mothers don't stop being mothers just because they go into the workforce. What they do is they replace their children with coworkers. They're still nurturing, they're still serving, but their family becomes the office. And feminist liberal women cannot help to still have domestic relationships with a man, but what they do is rather than serve one man in the family, they spread it out among many men in the business world. Their bosses at work become their husbands. So is that liberation? No. That's the worst kind of dependence. Women become wives and mothers to CEOs and to salesmen and to middle managers. They have simply traded off managing the home for managing some inane business. And that's a worse state of affairs. Alice Lloyd writes in the Weekly Standard about how feminism drives women to live double lives. She quotes Shirley Tilghman, president of Princeton, who speaks about women in the workforce. We just kind of live in this slightly made-up environment where we said there's no problem here. Lloyd writes, Tilghman said a mantra like secular prayer for guilt-free endurance to keep from drowning in the demands of her double life. Tilghman says, there is only one of me. I can only be in one place at one time. I love my work. I love my children. I'm not going to feel guilty when I'm in one place or the other. Then Lloyd writes, working mothers of her generation had to trick each other into thinking it could actually be done. And then Alice Lloyd goes on to quote another professional woman in the workforce concerning professional work outside the home. I think I felt I needed to prove my usefulness. And a second life at home provided purpose to fall back on. So this woman felt usefulness only in the workforce, in the office, on the factory floor. But she admitted she was finding true purpose in motherhood. And this is the lie of Satan, telling women that they're only useful in the workforce and that motherhood is not useful. We have a whole generation of girls being raised to think that motherhood or being a worker in the home, Titus chapter 2, verse 5, is useless. Feminist ideology has contributed to this. And I would also say that men in the past, in not honoring mothers and women, have contributed to this. I think we'd all agree that feminism could never have gotten a foothold in America if men would have honored and praised motherhood more. But as it was, husbands in the past would often see their work as being more important. They were bringing home the paycheck, and women's work was considered, well, just women's work. And so men paid a price for this neglect. And the apostasy probably started with the men. And so we can understand why women have felt the need to take on the role of men in order to find usefulness. To find self-worth. And even to find financial security. Because in that men in the 20th century have become promiscuous and have divorced their wives, women can no longer trust the bargain of marriage, the marriage covenant. The man goes out and builds a career. The woman is to stay home and do that important job of bearing and nurturing children. But if the men are abandoning the home, then women are going to need a career outside the home for security. And so one sin contributes to another sin. Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verse 18, one sinner destroys much good. However, when men failed to do their job, the solution for women was not to become men or to take the role of men, as the secular feminists propose. But the solution for women was to double down on their calling from God. Now that's not intuitive, but that's God's solution for when other people do not fulfill their calling around you. You're to respond by doing your calling all the more. How are you to overcome evil? Romans chapter 12, verse 21, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. So here's a question for you. How would history have been different if rather than reacting to unfaithful men with feminist women liberation, women reacted with a motherhood movement, emphasizing the importance of motherhood, training mothers to be professional preschool and elementary children educators? I'll let you think about that question. But it might have changed the men in America. It might have done what Paul said about those who overcome evil with good. Romans 12:20, for in so doing you will heap burning coals on his head. So, by way of conclusion, the bottom line, in claiming to free women from oppression and exploitation, what has feminism done? It has put women into more bondage and oppression, the very opposite that it claims to do. And that's exactly what the Apostle Peter says about false teachers in 2 Peter chapter 2. Verse 17, false teachers are springs without water, clouds without rain. In other words, they look like they're going to help, but they're empty. And then in verse 18, these false teachers speak arrogant words of vanity. Have you read the signs at the Women's March? I'm a feminist. What's your superpower? 50% American, 100% nasty. My body, my right. Arrogant words of vanity. And then in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 19, false teachers promise them freedom while they themselves are slaves of corruption. The false ideology promises freedom, but it only in slaves. Don't be deceived by the promise of liberation. A great verse that I've been studying recently in this regard is Isaiah chapter 32, verse 6. Listen to the wisdom of this prophecy. For a fool speaks nonsense, and his heart is inclined toward wickedness, to practice ungodliness and to speak error against the Lord. See, the fool described here is the false teacher, the feminist, the secularist, the relativist. But notice what the verse goes on to say. To keep the hungry person unsatisfied and to withhold drink from the thirsty. The leftist robs people of purpose and meaning, telling them that no one made them, they're just an accident of evolution, no one loves them, there's no right and wrong, and so they take away from people everything of value, everything that gives life meaning. Thinking that they're saving us, they leave us to a curse, unsatisfied and thirsty. They rob us of the good life that God has for us. As Jesus said, the thief comes to steal and to kill and to destroy. I am come that they might have life and they might have it more abundantly. And my prayer for you is that you come to Jesus and by faith embrace God's good plan for your life. Thank you for listening today. Don't forget to click on the subscribe button. Contact information is on the closing slide. May God richly bless you as you continue in His Word.